On the morning of March the 6th, 1944, Oberleutnant Reinhardt felt the first flutter of unease when his wingman's voice crackled through the radio, reporting American fighters at 7,000 meters, climbing, and the impossible part was that they were still climbing when his own Focke-Wulf had already reached its operational ceiling, and the throttle was pushed as far forward as it would go. The sky over central Germany was cloudless, crystalline, the kind of perfect visibility that made interception work clean and predictable. Reinhardt had been flying fighters for 3 years, first over the Channel, then Russia, now back to defend the fatherland against the daylight bombing raids that came with increasing frequency and increasing arrogance. He understood air combat the way a craftsman understands his tools. He knew the performance envelope of his FW-190, knew exactly how high it could go, how fast it could climb, where it held advantages and where it needed to compensate. For most of the war, those advantages had been sufficient, even decisive. German fighters climbed faster than most Allied aircraft, could reach higher altitudes, could dictate the terms of engagement by positioning themselves above enemy formations and diving through them with speed and energy that made counterattack difficult. The tactics were refined, practiced, embedded in muscle memory and operational doctrine. But something had changed in recent months, something that the intelligence briefings mentioned, but that the pilots themselves had only begun to encounter directly, and Reinhardt was about to understand exactly what that something meant. He levelled off at 7,200 meters, the highest he could maintain stable flight, and looked down at the bomber formation below, the familiar sight of B-17s in their combat boxes, bristling with defensive guns, flying in tight formation to maximize overlapping fields of fire. This was expected. This was the pattern. The German fighters would position themselves above and ahead, would coordinate their attacks, would dive through the formation at high speed, firing as they went, then breaking away before the defensive fire could track them effectively. The bombers' escort fighters, the Thunderbolts and Lightnings that accompanied them, were dangerous but manageable because they operated at similar altitudes, fought in the same vertical space, could be engaged according to known principles. Except today the escort fighters were not at similar altitudes. They were higher. They were above Reinhardt, above his entire staffel, above the ceiling that German fighters could reach and still maintain combat effectiveness. His wingman, Feldberg, called out positions, and Reinhardt craned his neck back, searching the bright sky above, and there they were, perhaps 800 meters higher, small dark shapes that glinted in the sunlight, maintaining station above the bombers, waiting. The recognition hit him like cold water. They had been outclimbed. The fundamental advantage that German fighter tactics relied upon, the ability to hold the high ground and dictate engagement terms, had been negated. The Americans were above him, which meant they had the energy advantage, which meant they could dive on German fighters at will, which meant the entire tactical framework he had learned and practiced had suddenly become obsolete. Reinhardt keyed his radio and reported the situation to the controller, keeping his voice steady even as his mind raced through implications. The response was terse. Proceed with attack on bombers, ignore escort if possible. This was doctrine speaking, the rigid insistence on mission objectives even when conditions had shifted. But doctrine was written by men on the ground who did not have to crane their necks back and watch enemy fighters circling 800 meters overhead, like hawks waiting for prey to expose itself. Reinhardt had survived 3 years of air combat, not by following doctrine blindly, but by reading situations, by understanding angles and energy and timing, and everything he understood told him that diving on those bombers with American fighters positioned above would be suicidal. They would come down while German fighters were committed to their attack runs, would hit them when they were slow and vulnerable and focused on the bombers, would tear through the formation before anyone could react. He gave the order to orbit and maintain altitude, to wait for an opening or additional support, and he could hear the frustration in his pilot's acknowledgements because everyone knew what waiting meant, knew that every minute they delayed gave the bombers more time to reach their targets, gave the escort fighters more time to adjust their positions, increased the likelihood that this entire mission would be a failure. but failure was better than annihilation. Reinhardt had seen too many good pilots die because they committed to attacks without properly assessing the situation, without recognizing when the variables had shifted beyond acceptable risk parameters. The Americans above them were not maneuvering aggressively, were not diving down to engage, and at first this seemed like hesitation or perhaps limited numbers. But as the minutes passed, Reinhardt began to understand it as something else, something more disturbing. They were patient. They were waiting for German fighters to commit, to dive on the bombers and surrender their altitude advantage, to make themselves vulnerable. This was not the behavior of pilots struggling with their aircraft's limitations. This was confident, tactical patience, the kind that came from knowing you held every advantage and could afford to wait for the enemy to make a mistake. 20 minutes into the mission, with fuel reserves diminishing and the bomber formation approaching its target area, Reinhardt made the decision. They would attempt one attack pass, coordinated, high speed, in and out as quickly as possible, accepting the risk because the alternative was returning to base without having engaged at all, which would be noted in reports and discussed in debriefings and used as evidence of declining morale or failing commitment. He ordered the Staffel into attack formation, nose down, building speed, aiming for the lead elements of the bomber formation, and for perhaps 15 seconds it seemed like it might work, like they might punch through and break away before the escort reacted. Then the Americans dove. They came down with speed that seemed impossible for their aircraft type, cutting through the altitude gap faster than Reinhardt would have believed, and suddenly the clean geometry of the attack dissolved into chaos. American fighters were everywhere, coming from angles that should not have been possible, firing from distances that should have been ineffective, and the radio filled with urgent warnings and calls for help and the particular silence that followed when someone was hit. Reinhardt broke left, pulling as hard as the Fokker-Wulf could manage, feeling the G-forces press him down into his seat, watching the world spin past his canopy in confused fragments. A P-51 flashed past his nose, close enough that he could see details of the paint scheme, and he fired instinctively, but the angle was wrong and the rounds went wide. He reversed, tried to follow, realized immediately that he could not match the turn radius, that the American fighter was outturning him, which should not have been possible, which violated everything he knew about the Mustang's performance characteristics. The intelligence briefings had mentioned improved models, modified engines, better superchargers, but hearing about improvements and experiencing them directly were completely different things. This aircraft was not just marginally better than the German fighters. It was superior in multiple dimensions simultaneously. It could climb higher, fly faster at altitude, turn tighter, accelerate more quickly, and the combination of these advantages created a performance envelope that simply dominated everything Reinhardt could do. He dove, using gravity to build speed, trying to disengage, to create separation, to get back to friendly airspace where the odds might be more favorable. But the P-51 followed, staying with him through the dive, matching his speed and position, and when Reinhardt tried to pull up, tried to convert speed back into altitude, the American fighter pulled up with him, stayed on his tail, and Reinhardt understood with absolute clarity that he was going to die unless something changed immediately. He snap-rolled left, pushed the nose down again, twisted through a series of violent maneuvers that stressed the aircraft to its limits, and somehow, through a combination of desperation and experience and luck, he managed to break the Americans' firing solution long enough for Feldberg to come screaming through from above, forcing the P-51 to break off, to evade, to momentarily lose position. Reinhardt did not wait. He pushed the throttle forward and ran, heading east at low altitude, using ground clutter and terrain masking to make himself harder to track, flying with the kind of focus that came from knowing that error meant death. Back at base, sitting in the debriefing room with what remained of his Staffel, the losses were calculated. 4 aircraft missing, 1 damaged beyond repair, 2 pilots wounded. The bomber formation had reached its target, delivered its payload, turned for home. The entire mission had been a failure measured by any meaningful metric, but what disturbed Reinhardt more than the tactical defeat was the wider implication. The Americans had demonstrated air superiority not through overwhelming numbers or lucky positioning, but through fundamental technological and performance advantages that German fighters could no longer counter. The reports from other units over the following weeks confirmed the pattern. American escort fighters were routinely operating at altitudes above German interception capabilities, were outclimbing and outperforming Luftwaffe aircraft that had dominated the sky for years. The psychological impact rippled through the fighter wings. Pilots who had been confident, even arrogant about their capabilities, began to question whether their aircraft were adequate, whether their tactics were valid, whether survival was even possible against opponents who held every measurable advantage. The older pilots, the ones who had flown since 1940 or 1941, remembered when German fighters had been the most advanced in the world, when Bf-109s had terrorized Polish and French pilots, when the Luftwaffe had seemed invincible. They remembered the gradual erosion of that advantage, the introduction of better Allied aircraft, the slow realization that Germany's technological edge was slipping. But this was different. This was not gradual erosion. This was a fundamental shift in the balance of air power, visible and undeniable and terrifying in its implications. If German fighters could not reach the bombers because American escorts held the high-altitude positions, if interception attempts were suicidal because the escorts could dive through German formations at will, then the entire defensive strategy for protecting German industry and cities had become untenable. The bomber formations would continue to come, day after day, and German fighters would be unable to stop them, and everything below would burn. Reinhardt flew 6 more missions over the next 2 weeks, and each one reinforced the lesson. The Americans had changed the rules of air combat, had introduced aircraft whose performance at high altitude exceeded anything Germany could field, and the Luftwaffe's response was improvised and desperate. Some units tried climbing to intercept altitude well before the bomber formations arrived, hoping to be in position when the Americans appeared, but this burned excessive fuel and reduced the time available for actual combat. Other units tried focusing exclusively on the bombers, accepting losses from escort fighters as inevitable, but this resulted in casualty rates that were unsustainable. There were discussions of new tactics, new formations, new approaches, but all of them were attempts to compensate for fundamental performance disadvantages that tactics alone could not overcome. The pilots knew it, the commanders knew it, and that knowledge changed everything about how they flew, how they fought, how they assessed their chances of survival. In the mess hall, conversations became quieter, more fatalistic. Men who had once competed to describe their aerial victories now compared notes on near escapes, on how they had survived encounters with P-51s or P-47s at high altitude. The mythology of the invincible German fighter pilot, the ace who could dictate terms through skill and courage alone, dissolved under the accumulating weight of experience. It did not matter how skilled you were if the enemy aircraft could outclimb you, outspeed you, outturn you at the altitudes where combat occurred. Skill could create opportunities and exploit mistakes, but it could not overcome physics. The Americans flying those high-altitude escorts were not necessarily better pilots, but they were flying better aircraft, and in modern aerial combat that advantage was often decisive. Reinhardt found himself studying intelligence reports obsessively, looking for weaknesses in the American fighters, for operational constraints that could be exploited, for anything that might restore some sense of parity. The P-51 Mustang, he learned, achieved its high-altitude performance through a sophisticated Packard-built Merlin engine with a 2-stage supercharger that maintained power output even in thin air where German engines struggled. The P-47 Thunderbolt used a massive turbocharger system that delivered similar benefits. These were not minor modifications or incremental improvements. These were fundamental engineering advantages that changed what was possible at 7,000 meters and above. German engineers were working on their own advanced engine designs, improved superchargers, jet engines that promised revolutionary performance, but these were future solutions to current problems. And pilots were dying now, today, in aircraft that could not compete. The rumors spread through the squadrons about the new jet fighters being tested, the Me-262 that supposedly had performance characteristics beyond anything the Allies could field, but the rumors also included information about production delays, about fuel shortages, about Hitler's insistence on modifying them as bombers rather than deploying them as fighters, and these rumors were more credible than the promises of technological salvation. Reinhardt tried to maintain belief that things would improve, that Germany would develop countermeasures, that the Luftwaffe would adapt and overcome, but the evidence was moving in the opposite direction. More American bombers, more escorts, better performance, increasing losses, declining capability. The trajectory was clear to anyone willing to see it, and what made it most disturbing was the helplessness of knowing what was happening and being unable to change it. On a mission in mid-April, Reinhardt's Staffel was vectored toward a large formation of B-17s approaching Leipzig. The weather was deteriorating, with scattered clouds that provided some cover for approach. The plan was to attack from above as always, but when they reached interception altitude they found American escorts already positioned higher, waiting, circling like predators. Reinhardt ordered the Staffel to hold position, to wait for the escorts to descend or move out of position. But they did not descend and they did not move. They simply maintained altitude and position, completely confident in their ability to respond to any German attack. This standoff continued for 12 minutes while the bomber formation proceeded toward its target unopposed. Reinhardt made the decision to attack despite the escorts, accepting the risk because allowing the bombers through without challenge was unacceptable. But before his pilots could begin their dive, one of the new pilots, Conrad, broke formation and ran, just turned and flew east at full throttle without explanation or authorization. Reinhardt watched it happen, saw the aircraft peeling away, and could not find it in himself to be angry because he understood exactly what Conrad was feeling, understood the calculation that survival in retreat was preferable to death in a futile attack. The attack went forward without Conrad, and it was as disastrous as Reinhardt had anticipated. The American escorts dove through the German formation, firing from angles that gave the German pilots no opportunity to respond, and within 30 seconds 2 FW-190s were falling, one trailing smoke and the other spinning uncontrollably. Reinhardt fired at a bomber, saw his rounds impact the wing, saw no significant effect, and then he was pulling up and away, evading, trying to survive, and an American fighter was behind him, firing, the tracers arcing past his canopy close enough to make him flinch. He dove again, rolled, pulled into a climbing spiral that stressed the aircraft to its structural limits, and somehow evaded long enough for the American to break off, to return to the escort position, to resume the patient circling that communicated absolute confidence and control. Landing back at base, Reinhardt found Conrad already there, standing beside his aircraft, looking defiant and ashamed simultaneously. The standard response to desertion would be court-martial, possible execution, public disgrace. But Reinhardt did not report it. He understood that Conrad had simply recognized the reality of the situation faster than the others, had calculated that dying for a gesture was pointless when the outcome was already determined. Instead, Reinhardt included him in the debriefing, treated the early departure as a tactical decision, maintained the fiction that everything had been conducted according to doctrine. The other pilots said nothing. They all understood. The code of honor that had governed Luftwaffe behavior for years was eroding under the pressure of operational impossibility. You could not expect men to maintain rigid discipline when the missions they were assigned had become suicide operations, when the aircraft they flew could not compete with enemy equipment, when every combat engagement demonstrated that technological disadvantage had made courage insufficient. The reports from other fronts were similar. On the Western Front, German fighters were being swept from the sky by American escorts that could maintain high-altitude station indefinitely. On the Eastern Front, Soviet aircraft were improving, becoming more capable, though still not matching the performance of the American fighters. The Luftwaffe was being compressed between advancing enemies with increasing technological advantages, and the defensive strategies that had been planned and prepared were collapsing because they had been based on assumptions about air superiority that no longer held. The High Command issued directives about fighting spirit and determination, about the need to engage despite losses, about the historical mission of defending the fatherland. But directives did not change performance specifications, did not make FW-190s climb higher or fly faster at altitude, did not solve the fundamental problem that German fighters had become obsolete in the single most important performance dimension for intercepting high-altitude bombers. Reinhardt continued flying missions because that was his duty and because stopping would require admitting defeat in a way that still felt impossible despite everything. But the nature of his flying changed. He became cautious, calculating, focused on survival rather than victory. He looked for opportunities where the odds were favorable, where American escorts were out of position or distracted, where attacks could be executed and broken off before the inevitable response arrived. This approach resulted in fewer losses, but also fewer successes, and the bomber formations continued streaming over Germany, dropping their payloads on cities and factories and rail yards, methodically destroying the industrial capacity that sustained German war production. Reinhardt would return from missions and see the smoke rising from Hamburg or Dresden or Berlin, would know that German fighters had been unable to prevent it, would understand that the air defense system had failed, not because pilots lacked courage or skill, but because they were flying inferior aircraft against opponents who had solved the high-altitude performance problem that Germany had not. In May, Reinhardt was promoted to Hauptmann and given command of a full Gruppe, which under normal circumstances would have been an honor, but which now felt more like being given responsibility for managing an inevitable defeat. The new position came with access to higher-level briefings, where the strategic picture was discussed with less propaganda and more brutal honesty than at squadron level. The numbers were devastating. Pilot losses were exceeding training capacity. Aircraft production was declining under bombing pressure. Fuel supplies were becoming critical. The jet fighters that were supposed to restore air superiority were being diverted to ground attack missions, or delayed by production problems, or withheld from deployment because Hitler wanted personal approval of how they were used. The defensive situation was deteriorating faster than anyone had predicted, and the American escorts operating at altitudes German fighters could not reach were a major factor in that deterioration. At night, lying in his bunk, Reinhardt thought about the first time he had encountered a P-51 at high altitude, the moment when he realized his Focke-Wulf could not climb to intercept, could not reach the position where effective engagement was possible. That moment had changed everything, had shifted his understanding of what the air war had become, had replaced confidence with calculation and certainty with doubt. He thought about all the other pilots who had experienced similar moments, whose assumptions about German air superiority had been shattered by direct experience with Allied aircraft that simply performed better at the altitudes where modern air combat occurred. The psychological impact of that realization rippled through the entire fighter force, changed tactics, altered morale, created a defensive posture where initiative and aggression gave way to survival and caution. The war continued, grinding forward through summer and into autumn, and the American bombing campaign intensified with each passing month. The escort fighters became a permanent feature of German airspace, high-altitude guardians that made interception increasingly difficult and increasingly costly. German pilots developed gallows humor about it, made jokes about needing oxygen masks just to see the Americans above them, about bringing ladders to climb closer to intercept altitude, but underneath the humor was recognition that they were fighting a losing battle against opponents who had achieved technological advantages that tactics alone could not overcome. Some pilots became fatalistic, accepted that their survival was primarily a matter of luck rather than skill. Others became aggressive to the point of recklessness, launching attacks despite impossible odds because rage at their helplessness demanded some kind of action. Most, like Reinhardt, found a middle path of calculated engagement, fighting when opportunities presented themselves, but avoiding the suicidal commitments that resulted in death without corresponding military value. By autumn, the situation had deteriorated further. American long-range escorts were now routinely accompanying bomber formations all the way to targets deep inside Germany, maintaining high-altitude coverage throughout entire missions. German fighters that attempted interception were consistently engaged from above, from positions where American pilots held every advantage. The casualty rates spoke for themselves. Experienced pilots were being killed or injured at rates that made the accumulation of combat experience nearly impossible. New pilots arriving from training schools were inadequately prepared for the reality of facing technologically superior aircraft flown by increasingly experienced American pilots. The Luftwaffe's fighter force was being ground down, not through single catastrophic defeats, but through accumulated losses that could not be replaced, through the steady erosion of capability that came from fighting at a fundamental disadvantage. Reinhardt survived the summer and autumn not through exceptional skill or courage, but through the combination of experience, caution, and statistical luck that determined survival in modern aerial combat. He learned to recognize situations where engagement was suicidal and to avoid them regardless of orders or doctrine. He learned to prioritize his pilot's survival over mission completion when the two came into conflict. He learned that the mythology of air combat heroism had been rendered obsolete by technological reality, that the Germans could no longer compensate for inferior aircraft through superior tactics or fighting spirit. These were hard lessons, acquired through experience that killed men who learned more slowly or who clung to outdated assumptions about what was possible. In December, his Gruppe was transferred east to face the Soviet advance, and Reinhardt felt relief that surprised him because at least on the Eastern Front the altitude disadvantages were less pronounced. The Soviet fighters operated in different tactical frameworks. The battles felt more like the kind of fighting he understood. But even there, rumors circulated about American fighters being transferred to Soviet units, about Lend-Lease programs that were providing the Soviets with the same high-altitude capable aircraft that had dominated German fighters in the West. The war was entering its final phase, and everyone who survived long enough to see it understood that Germany had lost the air superiority battle, had lost it specifically and definitively at high altitude, where American engineering had solved problems that German engineers had not, where escorts could position themselves above interception capability and render defensive strategies useless. On a cold morning in early January, Reinhardt stood beside his aircraft, watching his pilots prepare for another mission, and he thought about how different everything looked now compared to 3 years before, how the confident aggression had been replaced by grim-faced determination, how the tactical discussions focused on survival rather than victory. The war had taught many lessons, most of them bitter, but the lesson about high-altitude performance had been among the most psychologically devastating, because it revealed that German technical superiority, which had been a foundational assumption of Luftwaffe confidence, had been an illusion, had been superseded by Allied engineering that solved the supercharger problem more effectively, that maintained engine power in thin air where German engines struggled. That technical advantage, translated into operational reality, meant American fighters circling 800 meters overhead while German pilots stared up at them helplessly, meant bomber formations proceeding to targets unopposed, meant the systematic destruction of German industry and cities with Luftwaffe fighters unable to prevent it, despite desperate courage and tactical innovation. The sky above the airfield was clear and empty, waiting to be filled with violence and smoke, and the contrails of aircraft fighting at altitudes where human beings could barely breathe, where thin air made every maneuver harder and every performance disadvantage more pronounced. Reinhardt pulled on his gloves and climbed into the cockpit, going through the familiar pre-flight routine, knowing that somewhere above Germany, American fighters were already climbing to their high-altitude positions, already preparing to dominate the airspace where combat would occur, already demonstrating through their simple presence that technical capability had become more important than tactical skill or individual courage, and that Germany had lost that technical competition in ways that made eventual defeat not just possible, but increasingly inevitable with each passing day.